Good morning. It's Monday, March 14th. Welcome to Morning Joe. With us on set this morning, we have the former governor of Pennsylvania and NBC News political analyst Ed Rendell.
I don't know that I'd ever call him the former governor. He's like a Marine.
I just call him
Once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine. And if you're Ed Rendell, you're always governor.
Ed with us this morning. And columnist for the New York Times, Charles Blow. Great piece on Saturday.
Charles,
thank you.
I hope you have not unleashed a fury of fomenting from Miss Brzezinski on The Biggest Losers.
That was a good
childhood
piece.
obesity.
It's unbelievable. I don't know where to begin with that. We'll get to it. Also in Washington, MSNBC and Time Magazine senior political analyst Mark Halperin. Good to have you on board this morning, Mark, from Washington. A lot going on today. Should we get right to Japan?
Let's do it.
Japan is working to contain a humanitarian, nuclear, and economic crisis at this moment, 3 days after getting a hit by a devastating earthquake and tsunami. Right now, rescue workers are searching for survivors in the country's coastal towns where more than 10,000 people are estimated dead and millions of residents without power and clean drinking water. Safety concerns are also lingering over growing problems at nuclear facilities. Earlier today, 11 people were hurt when a second hydrogen explosion rocked a nuclear plant, sending a massive column of smoke into the air. That blast was felt 25 miles away, but the plant's operator says radiation levels are still within legal limits. Meanwhile, the U.S. now says it has moved its ships and aircraft away from one of the quake-stricken plants after discovering low-level radioactive contamination. And the New York Times reports that the USS Ronald Reagan passed through a radioactive cloud, causing crew members to receive a month's worth of radiation in about an hour. This was something we had a gut feeling about on Friday morning as the story was unfolding. And now it appears to be escalating.
Because the first reports out were that none of the nuclear plants were affected. Mika refused to read the script that way because it's, you just sort of knew if you had an 8.9 or a 9.0 earthquake that these facilities could be impacted. And that is the real story right now with Japanese officials racing against time. I know we have our newspaper segment, but you look at all of the headlines here, whether it's the Boston Globe. If you look, this is what the Washington Post is talking about. Again, Japan across the top. The USA Today, they're talking about an anxious wait, and it is an absolutely anxious wait. The Wall Street Journal, Mika, when we talk about the nuclear situation, the Wall Street Journal has it right. It is a race against time. And then the Financial Times, Japan fears a nuclear meltdown. And Ed Rendell, you come from the state that understands the fears of a possible nuclear meltdown with 3 Mile Island, a situation that really slowed down nuclear development in this country for 30 years. Tell us what happened in Pennsylvania and how it compares to what's happening here.
Well, there was a meltdown, but it wound up being fairly well contained, and there wasn't one death attributable to the meltdown in central Pennsylvania.
Even over 30 years.
Over 30 years, not one death attributable to it. It was contained, but again, it didn't suffer, that reactor didn't suffer the structural damage that the ones in Japan did. That reactor was never reactivated. It was basically trashed. The interesting question here is I heard someone from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission say that our reactors, every reactor built in the U.S. as either was built to withstand earthquakes or retrofitted to withstand earthquakes. Now, I'm not sure that's true. Right. And can anybody withstand an 8.9?
Exactly, because, of course, as we talked about on Friday, Charles, everything in Japan and this region, since they are on the Pacific Rim of Fire, and since this region gets 90% of the earthquakes in the world, they were probably prepared as well. I suspect, though, they just never expected a 9.0 plus the kicker, the tsunami waves, which wiped out the radiators that were, not the radiators, wiped out the, you know what I'm talking about, wiped out the backup plan to cool down the reactor.
Right. Well, one important thing to remember is that at least Unit 1, the Reactor 1 there, was built 40 years ago.
Right.
It's a very old facility. It kind of predates a lot of their kind of readiness for earthquakes and tsunamis now. Second, they had a seawall there that would have or should have protected them pretty well in a normal circumstance, but not a tsunami of this magnitude.
Right.
So the water kind of caps over. The other part of the problem there is a lot of the electrical is built in the basement. So everything floods. They can't even get to it to kind of reactivate. They have to put people in the middle.
Interesting to follow up what Charles said. We have a great high number of our reactors in this country that are old.
Yeah, and you know, Mika, I said radiators. I meant generators.
Right.
And you sort of just sat there wondering why didn't you? Of course, you can look back and hindsight's 20/20, but you wonder why they didn't put those on the roof or put them at a higher level where tsunami waves
if you listen to theoretical nuclear physicists talking about, the potential here, this was not supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line. You can't prepare for what was not supposed to happen. And that's exactly, they're right now in a situation where they're dealing with and nobody wants to hear these words, last-ditch effort to cool it down by using seawater.
Right. And, of course, they use seawater on one of the reactors because, like you said, they're 40 years old and they were ready to just trash it. Mark, it's already becoming in the early stages of becoming a political issue in the United States. A lot of people have been talking about nuclear power and restarting it, how the French got it right, how America got it wrong. And I suspect this tragedy is going to frame our debate moving forward on nuclear power, isn't it?
There's no question it's going to, and if things get worse in Japan in these reactors, it's going to frame it even more. There's two cautions, I think, from the Japanese experience that are going to inform the American debate and should. One is the Japanese are the most meticulous, careful planners in the world, and they knew that they had an potential earthquake problem. They built these reactors as best they could to withstand it. If they couldn't get that right, if they couldn't put themselves beyond harm's reach, that's going to be a big caution for a lot of Americans. The other thing is what's going on now. As great as the Japanese are as planners, one of their weaknesses is they're not as forthcoming during public crises as some governments are, and as we expect our government to be. It's going to be important that the public demand and the press demand that they be forthcoming about what the actual dangers are and not sugarcoat it and not try to gloss over the truth.
And that conversation has already started. Some American politicians are considering whether to stop construction of new nuclear power plants here in the U.S. Senators Schumer, Lieberman, and McConnell all expressing their concerns on the Sunday talk shows.
I'm still willing to look at nuclear. As I've always said, it has to be done safely and carefully.
I don't want to stop the building of nuclear power plants, but I think we've got to kind of quickly put the brakes on until we can absorb what has happened in Japan as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami.
This discussion reminds me somewhat of the conversations that were going on after the BP oil spill last year. I don't think right after a major environmental catastrophe is a very good time to be making American domestic policy.
I agree with Senator McConnell 100%. And, it's interesting you brought up BP because you have people saying, oh, we can't use nuclear power. But, Charles, you look at what happened with BP, you look at how messy all of our means of energy technology are right now.
There's no pure, clean choice.
Yeah, there's not a pure, clean choice.
And by the way, foreign oil hasn't done well for our fate and for the lives of American people as well. So
nuclear has to be part of the mix. I mean, our energy supply equation has to include a lot of options. Nuclear has to be part of the mix. I do think, however, it is smart to reconsider all nuclear plants that are in harm's way. I mean, putting things in California is probably not the smartest place to put new nuclear facilities. There are some already there. But putting those kinds of facilities in areas that are compromised by natural disaster risk is probably not the smartest thing.
Right.
There are varying degrees of risks, and I agree with Senator McConnell, but there are varying degrees of risks. Wind energy has risk to bats and birds, and there's no question about it. And I've heard from environmentalists as I expanded wind energy in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So there is no form of energy. Natural gas drilling, the controversy that's going on among environmentalists. So as Mika said, there's nothing absolutely pure and safe. I think you're going to see no new sightings. This absolutely takes the legs out under new sightings. In other words, in a new
You really
location,
think so?
In a new location. I, as governor, permitted one additional nuclear plant, but it was a tower to be built at the site of a pre-existing plant. Yeah. And I think that's what we're going to see as we go forward, Joe. Every time something like this happens, it makes it almost politically impossible.
I think it may be different this time only because we've been wringing our hands, at least over the past decade, that we haven't moved more aggressively on nuclear, because it is something that we can build here. Right. It is something that we don't have to export from overseas. It is something that we can build, and if we build it safely, we don't have to have the byproducts of the pollution, whether you talk about natural gas or coal or oil. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, that's why I think you're right. I don't think we can stop, and I think Charles is right. You can't take it out of the equation. But I think politically, it's so. I remember trying to site a trash-to-steam plant in Philadelphia back in the 80s. It was as if you were delivering cancer to everyone's doorstep.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be very hard. But you can build additional reactors near pre-existing reactors where the people have sort of gotten used to the risk a little bit.
And there are a lot of places like that. Now, we have over 100 nuclear sites in the United States, in 31 states. A lot of people have gotten used to the idea that they are near.
I think that it remains to be seen. I mean, these pictures coming out of Japan, the situation there is nothing less of apocalyptic. And yet, if we have a meltdown and there are the lingering effects of something like that there, how then does this conversation go on? There's no way. Amid the devastation in Japan, there are incredible stories of survival and hope. As the tsunami approached last Friday, a 60-year-old man says he made the regrettable decision to return home to collect some belongings, and minutes later he was pulled out to sea, clinging to the roof of his house. Miraculously, the man was spotted this weekend by rescuers 10 miles offshore after spending 2 days at sea, still clinging to that roof. When he was rescued, he reportedly broke down in tears, saying he thought, quote, that day was going to be the last day of my life. His wife, by the way, is still missing. There are story after story after stories like this of incredible rescues and incredible reunions, and then multiplied by the tens of thousands, horrific stories of people severely injured or perished in this.
Absolutely tragic. Absolutely
it is, tragic. And we're. I don't think it's over. I have a bad feeling about the nuclear situation there. I don't know. We're dealing with yet another explosion now, days later. I don't know how they get through this, how this happens, how an earthquake of this magnitude, Mark Halperin, happens without some sort of bad situation at the nuclear power plants in Japan.
And Mark, what do you expect Washington to do this week? What will we do to reach out? I know we've begun. What else do you expect Congress to do and the president?
Well, in terms of the executive branch, again, the Japanese government, close ally of the United States, not always the most forthcoming with public health information and information in the case of emergencies. They had a large earthquake there a decade and a half ago in Kobe, during which the government was severely criticized for not being forthcoming. You already see in the American press reports of what the American government, including the Defense Department, is saying about the dangers at these nuclear plants, about the scale of the destruction. All of that should not be coming from the American government. It should be coming from the Japanese government. They are a great country with a lot of strengths. Strong prime ministers is not one of them. They're on their 5th prime minister in, I think, 2 years. And the current prime minister is just not a strong figure. At least he hasn't been. It's going to require their government to step forward. If it doesn't, I think you are going to see Congress and maybe even the president be critical of the Japanese. No one wants to be in that posture now. But they've got to take a leadership role, not just domestically, but internationally, because this has international implications.
All right, we're going to continue the conversation. There are other stories to cover as well this morning. Coming up, Newark Mayor Cory Booker will be here on set. Also, economist Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Also, 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl. Up next, Governor Haley Barbour heads to Chicago to take on President Obama on his home turf. It's one of the top stories next in the Politico.